Good morning and good afternoon and good evening maybe to all of you. Thanks so much for joining us today at that CDAC Networks event for the HNPW this year. It's great to see so many of you here for what we really plan to be a sort of informal and friendly discussion amongst network members and guests who are also interested in this topic. You'll know that the topic today that we're talking about, or the title of our event, is Information as a Right, What's Holding Us Back, as you can see there. So where did this come from? You know, many of you will know CDAC well. We were founded about 15 years ago to really try to promote the concept of communication is aid, information is aid. We've been working, we've been having this, our sort of strap line has been com is aid. And really in the time since the setup of CDAC, there's been huge progress in terms of how communication, community engagement and accountability is seen and included within the humanitarian system. Obviously, AAP, I think, has been really grown in significance. It's now a formal part of the humanitarian system, as well as a formal part of, you know, other systems and networks that are engaged in leadership around humanitarian response. So, you know, within these huge advancements, I think when we've been reflecting as part of our new strategy, we're seeing a slight tipping of the balance in the conversation towards information and communication within the humanitarian system. So looking at feedback mechanisms and the ways that we can communicate better about the action that is happening, you know, within the formal humanitarian structure, which I think is a really positive development, and we really work within that. But also we're just asking ourselves, has this come at the cost of the conversation around providing better services and information, ensuring that dialogue and information and communication is provided within communities and for communities, and that dialogue is facilitated. So we know that information as aid is underpinned by the fundamental rights and democratic principles, such as the right to information, to freedom of expression and to participation, and that ostensibly most of our work is founded on these principles, but also that there's, you know, some operational and political realities that may place some constraints. When we had our annual General Assembly this year, our board has developed something from that talks about this kind of self-serving communication and community engagement that you know, we might be focusing on within a fairly restricted AAP agenda. So as we start to sort of tease this out as the CDAC network, we're renewing our focus this year on information as a right. And with the help of our panelists today, we'll be exploring that in more detail. So without further ado, let me introduce you today to our panelists. All are from CDAC network members. First of all, we have Asiya Kambal, who is the project manager for Internews's Rooted in Trust project in Sudan, working with humanitarian and public health responders, as well as the media, to help address community feedback, rumors, misconceptions about the pandemic, COVID-19 vaccine, and other health issues. She has also worked in humanitarian communications with the International Committee of the Red Cross and Médecins Sans Frontières. Also, we have Catherine Alcaraz, who is the AAP Working Group Coordinator with IOM Ethiopia, seconded by the Swedish Civil Contingency Agency to IOM to support the clusters and the humanitarian country team's aim of strengthened collective accountability. Also, Layla Mohammed, she's an editor and leads a team of 30 Somali journalists at Radio Ergo. IMS, International Media, supports unique service providing daily humanitarian information to the Somali public. And finally, we have Philippa Hill. Philippa is Save the Children's Global Head of Humanitarian Child Rights, Participation and Accountability. And in previous roles over the last decade, she's deployed to numerous crises, including protracted conflicts, epidemics, displacement contexts, and natural disasters. So a huge welcome to our panel today. So I'm going to come straight to you, straight to all of you. But I think that to bring a bit of flavour to this, let's start by trying to understand what we mean when we're talking about a rights-based approach to communication, information, and dialogue, and how it might differ from information as aid. Layla, I'm going to come to you first, and Asia next. So Layla, Radio Ergo provides information services in Somalia. What does a rights-based approach look like in the work that you do?
Thank you, Rosie. Thank you for all for coming and being here today. Access to information means that people can have issues affecting them and had their voices on the radios. Radio Ergo ensures that all the voices are heard on the radio programs, and also we do storytelling by talking about people's lives and livelihoods and issues that are affecting them. We play a critical role ensuring that all topics involving people's lives and humanitarian issues are covered. Those issues include daily stories of people's lives, including livelihoods, and also talking about those who are in the camps, pastoralists, and farmers, and those who are marginalized, and IDPs, and also people who are living disabilities. So we cover a range of topics, and also have a call-in platform that enables people to call us and voicemail us, and we also share those voices written in English to humanitarian NGOs, UN agencies, governmental authorities, and all those people, so that these people could get help. There are success stories that involve our day-to-day or daily programs. People call us to tell us that this information we are airing give them hope, and those voices, when we had, it gives us to continue the work we are doing and plan more to cover the range of topics we are doing right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Layla. And my next question is for Asia, who I think is here. Asia is in Sudan at the moment, so we're having some problem with the internet. Asia, I'm going to ask the question. I think you're online. So I'm going to come to you next. Thanks very much, Layla. Asia, in your experience, why is it important to emphasize a rights-based approach when we talk already about information as aid?
Sure, thank you so much for having me here. I think we've said time and time again that information saves lives. We've talked about this within our sector a lot, and that information is a form of relief, like food assistance, health, and protection. But it always seems to fall at the end of, a long list of priorities. In humanitarian action, information is very much at the end of the list. And I think looking at information from a rights-based approach really changes the game. So for people like impacted by conflict, displacement, or other humanitarian crisis, when information turns into a right, it is our right to have access to information. We can hold you accountable. That also changes the power dynamic, and affected people affected by humanitarian crisis can hold us, humanitarians, and authorities accountable, as well as other actors. But looking at information simply from the lens of it being as aid really makes it seem like it's something that we can do. It is not a priority. It is not something we we have to do or act upon or create a space, a safe space for communities to engage with us and to hold us accountable. It's more like something nice that we are doing. And I really think shifting it from information as aid more as looking at it from a right-based approach is really enhancing people's dignity and really amplifying their voices in the conversation. Internews, that's really important to us, and it's part of the organization's history. It's very much influenced by the civil rights movement in the US, which is to increase also through our work people's not only access to information, but information that is pertinent, information that they need in the language that they prefer, in the channels or methods, in the formats that they prefer as well. Yeah, over to you.
Thanks, Asia. I think that Catherine, are we having some connection challenges this morning? Maybe Catherine has dropped off. And I'm going to come, Philippa, to you. You know, we're hearing, obviously just heard, you know, a bit of a roundup of what we're talking about today. But, you know, like many organizations, Save the Children has a rights-based strategy, really, including when it comes to engagement and information. And why do you think these rights are discussed, you know, less, basically, so much less than other rights, such as the right to education, right to shelter, food and protection, for example?
Thank you very much. Yes, and absolutely, we are a rights-based organization. We do have a rights-based strategy, but I think I need to be open and transparent and say that there is not a consistent understanding of what it means to be rights-based in practice within Save the Children, and I think within the wider humanitarian sector. And we do often still see this idea of like needs and rights being used interchangeably. So I think, you know, while there is recognition that information is vitally important within humanitarian contexts, we do still see this lingering perception that Asia was referencing, that information and participation are luxuries, that we can consider them after all of the other rights have been met. People don't always understand that, you know, the right to information, the right to participation can be life-saving in and of themselves, can be life-enhancing. And so kind of we see this argument that, you know, once people's right to protection, once people's right to health has been achieved, then we can start thinking about these other things, which overlooks one of the key differences between a needs-based, one of the key values of a rights-based approach is that when we adopt that, we also adopt human rights principles, including that rights are indivisible and interdependent. So that means that, you know, these rights, they can't be separated from each other. And one set of rights, the right to protection or the right to health, can't be meaningfully realized without the realization of others. So that recognizes that if, you know, we want, for example, children in a humanitarian crisis to be protected, to be able to go to school, those children also need to have access to information and to be able to participate in decisions that affect them. And so, like, within that conceptualization of rights, there's no hierarchy. So we should be trying to you know, support people's rights at all times, which of course is challenging in practice, but if we don't start trying, then we'll never do it. And I think also, you know, when we're thinking about the value of a rights-based approach, we should also reflect on other key principles such as universality, the fact that it really pushes us to understand that everybody has these rights, that we should be trying to promote these rights no matter if, you know, someone is coming from a more disadvantaged background, that might be harder to provide and uphold those rights for them, and inalienability. So those rights continue to be held even if we're in a context of a crisis. I think kind of one of the other reasons why these rights are discussed less, perhaps, also links back to something that Asia mentioned, in that rights to participation and information, I think, are inherently more challenging to typical humanitarian ways of working than rights to health, education, protection, etc. because like within how those rights are expressed, there's no way of continuing to treat children or crisis affected adults as passive recipients of aid. For example, in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the freedom of expression includes the right to seek, receive and impart information. So that means that we have to recognize children as active agents who they're not just sitting there waiting to receive information, they can demand it from us, and they can also play an active role in sharing information. And I think that's something that's quite interesting with what Layla was mentioning about Radio Ergo, that it's not just about pushing information out there, there's also opportunities for communities to share information back and have a dialogue. So yeah, I think some of it does come down to the fact that this conceptualization of participation and information as rights challenges power dynamics that are still very prevalent in humanitarian aid.
Thanks, Philippa, and that's a really good outline from all of you there. Just before we're going to come on to talk about, to sort of build on some of these constraints and to explore whether we think, they're genuine constraints or where they exist from. Just before, I see we've got you back, Catherine, which is great. You're the AAP working group coordinator in Ethiopia. Do you think there's a distinction between information as aid and information as a right? And to what extent do your discussions within the working group include these sorts of discussions on rights in the context of your group?
Yeah, thank you, Rosie. That cutoff came at the perfect time. So in terms of information as aid and information as right, I don't think there's a distinction. The distinction comes on how agencies operationalize information as aid and information as a right. Because when you say information as aid, somehow it gives the impression, it implies that it's one way, us giving something to the communities, program details, informing them of who we are, what our mandate is, what services we are able to provide. And of course, that has leveled up to two-way communication with having feedback mechanisms, ensuring that we are engaging them about our services. But when you say information as a right, that somehow raises the level of engagement where affected communities are at the center of the response and are given the space to exercise their right to, as Felipe said, to increase participation and feedback in starting from program identification, program delivery, design, delivery, implementation, up to identifying the lessons learned for future responses. And it's also ensuring that the barriers to equal participation of the different vulnerable groups are addressed. So at the AAP working group level, it is very much front and center in our discussions. And it's not just in Ethiopia, it's not just with the AAP working group, it's also with the ICCG, the Intercluster Coordination Group, and the Humanitarian Country Team. The discussions now are also on how the humanitarian response as a whole can further promote the affected communities' right to information and right to participate. Because as individual agencies, we may be doing a good job as promoting the right to participate. But as a whole, we need to be able to coordinate also and to have that collective accountability. We're talking increased coordination and information sharing even among agencies so that we are able to respond more effectively and more efficiently to affected communities. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. So I think we're sort of just reinforcing in many ways this our initial point. I mean, really, that it's not two separate concepts. The concept of information as aid is underpinned by these fundamental rights and the democratic principles. So I guess it's just useful to maybe dig in slightly to what is holding us back, which is the question that we're looking at today. Maybe Layla, if I can come back to you, looking at this question of what is holding us back, I'd be interested to hear from you on what some of the constraints are that you face in your work around implementing a rights-based approach, and what maybe you can go into a little bit of what the consequences are of some of those constraints.
Thank you again. Our reporting mainly is from our reporters in Somalia, but we also have we also get materials which are in English and information that could help people when it comes to weather warning or outbreaks, health issues, and other related issues that are concerning people's lives, and also involve to have experts on, maybe from NGOs, UN agencies, and also governmental officials. So there are constraints that we cannot solve unless there's a collaboration within those agencies. Sometimes, as we are a media outlet and talk about humanitarian, we cannot just go on with materials and say it to the people. We need experts who can talk and explain and what the English materials are saying. So it's hard to find those experts, Somali speakers within those agencies. And those are the constraints that's holding us back, but it doesn't affect us mainly. But if it's maybe if we could get cooperation from those areas, it could help more people get information as it happens. Thank you.
Thanks, Layla. So maybe if it's an issue around kind of prioritization and resources for those sorts of actions. Asia, I'd like to come to you next. You talked a little about power, and other panelists have as well. Do you think we're just more comfortable with this sort of concept maybe of information as aid, or we're in a maybe looking away from the semantics even, maybe we're just in a kind of comfort zone, or do you think the issue is more structural?
Thank you so much, Rosie. That's such a great question. I think it's both, actually, a combination of both. I think we're comfortable with talking about information as aid, providing information to people about the services we provide, about assistance, about protection, and more focused on us as organizations, or particularly as humanitarian or international organizations, bringing that emphasis on us and what we can offer and what we can provide, and keeping the conversation within that space. Of course, there are humanitarian organizations that are really doing a lot to improve this and to widen the room for discussion and dialoguing. But I think the other issue is also structural. It's really difficult to speak up and to share your criticism, share your concerns, share your needs, your complaints, if that space is not being provided. I noticed this from the beginning of my career in the humanitarian sector. I observed concerning power dynamics and information imbalance. It plays out in an office setting between local aid workers in the same organization and also their international counterparts or mobile relief workers. I found that the minority of my mobile or international aid workers had a monopoly over like vital information that was essential for the success of the activities, for the team's work, while you find often that local aid workers were excluded from accessing this key information. And I really sense that the hierarchy was this type of hierarchy was negatively impacting the relationship dynamics between colleagues in the same office and really hindering effective humanitarian action. So if we are to imagine that this is in some form playing out still in humanitarian settings, this same power dynamic is perpetuated in a humanitarian setting where services or some form of assistance or relief is being provided. And we really need to recognize these structural issues and find ways to counter them, to make changes. And we have the history also of colonialism and how information really affected peoples seeking their independence, seeking autonomy, and how this power imbalance kept big groups of people colonized or subjected to colonialism and marginalization for so long. So having access to information is really important because it allows you to, it puts us in more equal grounds if everyone has, access to information that they need, reliable information, so they could make really informed decisions for themselves. And I think we say that we all the time, and of course the intention is there, but good intentions are not enough. We need to really place some actions. And I also wanted to highlight something, that it's really hard to stand up and say, no, I don't want this. No, this type of flour is not good for me. I need this other type of flour, or I need this type of food. That's not what I eat within my community, because we don't have that space. And then also when you're in a conflict setting, or when you're a displaced person and you've lost so much, how can you say, people often find themselves in a situation where it's hard to say no. So it is our role as humanitarians to provide that space, to really recognize these structural issues, this power imbalance, and to have set some strategies to really counter this and make people feel space, and that they will not be, nothing is going to happen to you if you criticize us, or you're not happy about a certain service that's being provided, or an assistance, or something that's happened. People should feel comfortable and should feel safe to express themselves. And we also have to start to get comfortable as humanitarians. We should start getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, with being challenged, with not being in power and in control all the time. Over to you, Rosie.
Thanks, Asia. Some really interesting points there. Maybe I'll just I'm going to come on to Catherine in a minute, but Philippa, maybe I saw you nodding a lot. Maybe you'd like to sort of reflect on that. And I know I was going to ask you about some of the more systemic blockages with your focus on global policy, but maybe you can, you'd like to reflect on that or come in, and then I'll come to you next, Catherine.
Sure. Yeah, I think, as you see, I was nodding a lot. I agree very much with what Asi was sharing. And I think, yes, we do need to reflect on systemic blockages. And when we're doing that, I think really connecting to what Asi was talking about, we need to go deep and link it to some of the soul searching that is either happening or should be happening related to the past and future of humanitarian aid. Because there is this kind of history of paternalism within humanitarian action, where humanitarian actors impose actions on affected people with good intentions, often the intention of helping them, but it can often still be very paternalistic, and that doesn't support the rights-based approach. And again, as Asia mentioned, that effort should be linked to work around decolonization of aid. I think kind of from a specific, child rights organization perspective, one of the consistent kind of barriers we see both within the organization, but often, outside and across society is the conceptualization of childhood as well, which is another kind of layer of power dynamics that creates challenges when we're trying to promote children's rights to participation in information. So generally across the world, children are still conceptualized as somewhat, becoming humans. They're children are seen as lacking capacity, lacking agency, lacking ability. And that can often lead people to assume that they don't need to engage with them in a dignified and meaningful way. So Save the Children has recently been doing some work around, for example, child participation in peace building, and we've been working with children in the Philippines, Mali and Colombia. And one of the consistent barriers that we're seeing is that people assume that children lack the capacity to engage in peace processes, and so therefore it's not worth us providing information about peace processes to children. Whereas we need to kind of flip that on its head and think about, it's actually on us as people who have much more easy access to information, who have more power to do everything that we can to provide information. It's us who are the people who are potentially failing rather than children or affected people. I think kind of one of the other perhaps recurrent barriers within the humanitarian system is perhaps how we might interpret some of our adherence to humanitarian principles, which can make us more hesitant to engage with governments. And of course, if we're thinking about a rights-based approach, we should be engaging with governments as they're often the primary duty bearers. They should be responsible for promoting rights to participation, to freedom of expression, etc. But we can often be a little bit more worried about engaging with governments. And I think that's something that needs to shift and is already shifting. But I think there is a risk when we start to have like abstract discussions or discussions at a global policy level, that we lose that connection to what is happening within responses, and what affected people, what local and national actors and what national country office staff are doing. And really, that's where I've seen the most innovation and the most creativity and the most exciting work happening in this area. It's been from people trying things out within humanitarian responses rather than people at the global level trying to push things down. So I think throughout these discussions, we need to retain that connection and not let global policy become abstracted from the reality of humanitarian action.
Thanks, Philippa. Raising some big issues, but I think perhaps that our audience have some things to say on. Just a reminder to the participants that we will be going soon to a round of audience questions, so do keep your questions coming. Catherine, when we were talking in advance of this meeting, you were mentioning that the humanitarian country team is prioritizing AAP and mainstreaming it across different working groups within Ethiopia. Do you think that this might be, go some way to overcoming some of the barriers to a more rights or deepening or further embedding our rights-based approach?
Yes, thank you, Rosie. So the Ethiopia HCT endorsed last year, late November, the HCT AAP action plan. And there, when we did the action planning, all these barriers, all these constraints that have been mentioned by my colleagues were mentioned in that particular meeting. I'd also like to cite SES cited about touched up on the issue of localization and how communities, how local CSOs or NGOs are unable to speak up because a bigger organization was there who had more voice than them, which is really it's an opportunity that we miss if we don't work with these local CSOs and local NGOs, because they have the history with the communities. More often than not, they have been there for years and years, also implementing development projects. So they have that strong relationship with the community. And when we take all those learnings, all those strategies from those local organizations, it brings forward a richer community feedback for the humanitarian response to work on. In terms of collective accountability, at the moment, the AAP working group we have a collective feedback platform where we ask our partners to consolidate all their community feedback monthly, and it's analyzed and consolidated at the national level. And these are presented monthly to the ICCG and up for discussion. And from those issues, from those identified concerns, then we are able to come up with stronger advocacies with the different sectors, with the different clusters, and ultimately with the HCT. And as Felipe said, it makes for stronger conversations when we are working, when we are having dialogues with the government. Also, one more thing with the Ethiopia Humanitarian Country Team, when we're discussing also with donors, because when we're talking community engagement, accountability, the funding comes in. Do we have the right people? Do we have funding to strengthen existing feedback mechanisms in place? Or because sometimes the donors would come in, create a proposal, make sure you have feedback mechanisms. But if those mechanisms are already in place, then have the flexibility to strengthen those mechanisms. There's no need to create new mechanisms. Strengthen those so that there is continuity with the dialogues with the communities, with the local NGOs and local CSOs. And then we are also able to have that conversation with donors, to have the flexibility, because we're promoting getting community feedback so we can adapt our programming and do corrective actions. With the donor support, that strengthens our stand in terms of accountability and increasing participation of the communities. Over.
Thanks, Catherine. We have a lively chat, which I'm not able to follow, but hopefully everyone else is, and some questions. Just before we open up for audience questions, I'm going to do just a quick round with all of you on the panel, just to look at some of what you would propose as some of the actions that we could take and opportunities that we can leverage as we sort of refocus around these rights. I'm going to come, Leila, to you first, if that's okay, and just what you think are some of the opportunities that we could be really making the most of, or I guess interested if there's quick wins or things that you think might be good starting points. So Leila, over to you.
I think maybe when it comes to media organizations and other NGOs, it affects us differently. For us, Radio Ergo is more about giving information to people that are helping them. When it comes to sharing information, we think of how the information is helping people, why we are doing it now, how do we do it, and what are the benefits for the people when we air those information on the radio. We are not the same as other media outlets in Somalia because we use shortwave to reach more people in the wider area in Somalia and Somali-speaking region in Horn of Africa. And when it comes to other media outlets, maybe most of them are FMs, which are based in the cities and we use also some Batina FMs to reach city population so that they can have the information we are sharing. So mainly when those FMs, not the ones we are Batinat with, when they are sharing information, maybe they see it as share this so that people can have. But Radio Ergo is more likely how this information affecting people to survive in the areas they are. So I think to have availability of partnership with NGOs and government authorities and other NGOs involved in or working as a humanitarian, it will give us opportunities to give information to more people, maybe what they have, what they are doing, and what they can collaborate with us so that their maybe work is shared with wider wider people, so that maybe in a way it will be is information as aid, So I think there are more opportunities we can work. We reach some of the NGOs so that we could get more information. So I think it involves if they are willing to, collaborate with us, but we are not tiring, or we will continue to do so and reach more agencies so that our information is variety and also is something that's helping people to do their life through this and lifestyles. So yeah.
Thanks, Layla. So yeah, sort of refocusing on good analysis of the information and what's needed, but also I think a really important point on making sure that the partnerships are broad enough to really be able to respond effectively. And particularly, obviously, a focus for CDAC is ensuring that we're able to partner really effectively with media partners and other agencies involved in communication. Catherine, maybe would come to you next, just as the audience continue to think. What do you think? Do you think that actors in the humanitarian space are sort of worse at this than those in development? What can be learned from how a more of a nexus approach?
I don't think we're humanitarians space worse than those in development. It's just that the development space, they've had more time and they've used these strategies for a longer time. When we talk in humanitarian space, when we talk about community participation, they've had participatory approaches for the longest time. We borrowed it into the humanitarian space. When we talk about feedback mechanisms, for them, it's community consultations, community meetings, and it's all embedded in the development framework. And when we use the term empowerment, that comes also from the development side of things, where the principle is development by the people, for the people, and with the people. In the humanitarian, we use the people-centered approach. But the advantage of the development side is they have more time. When they start a program, they integrate into the community, study the dynamics, gain the trust of the community, so that then the communities are able to define what development is for them, and they define the steps according to their capacity and capabilities. In the humanitarian space, we're very limited with time. An emergency comes in, vulnerabilities increase, and depending on the resilience of the community, that's how we act on. And sometimes it becomes a, should I say, excuse or it becomes a reason for agencies to come in. We don't have time. We don't have time. We need to respond to the emergency immediately. We don't have time to do these assessments, to do all these consultations. But in protracted emergencies, you already know it comes over and over again. One thing that is, I believe, a strength of the EP when we're talking about government collaboration, cooperation. One thing that is a strength of the government of Ethiopia, they have this seasonal assessments, and they do it annually, 2 seasonal assessments every year. They could just say, we'll do the assessment when the flooding is more extreme. But no, they do it regularly because they know that change is it's very dynamic. The situations in the regions are very dynamic, and each region, the context is very different. So they do it all the time. For us, and that is in the development framework, us as humanitarians should be able to go in, have these discussions with them. They're doing their regular assessments. Can we come in? These are our priorities as humanitarians. These are the services that we are able to give. How can we support these mechanisms that are already in place on the development side with the government? And speaking of connecting to the nexus, I do believe there is already connection even before the nexus term even before the nexus term came up, because most of our agencies, most of our partner agencies, Plan International, Save the Children, World Vision, they have both humanitarian and development programs running in parallel. So if as an agency, they are able to do that, then we could level that up to having those conversations with the humanitarian side and the development side of the work. Because some of the community feedback, some of the issues and concerns that come up in the humanitarian, in emergencies, the long-term solutions are in the development side. So when are we going to have those conversations? If we're talking durable solutions, if we're talking rebuilding communities, we have to start those discussions now. So that connection, that linkage should be there. Over.
Thanks, Catherine. And I'm glad you that you ended on it. There's no excuses, because that's what I was going to come in with. I think it links to Layla's point, doesn't it? Around we're not setting up the appropriate partnerships. They have the right people involved, but because it's an emergency, it's an emergency. But obviously, yes, there's no excuses. No excuses, but really important that we look that we get the right analysis, that we understand the needs and rights effectively. Philippa, what coming to you, sorry, just quickly, and then we're going to make some space. What would a shift in approach? We've talked about, I think unanimously we believe that a shift would be appropriate, is necessary. What would a shift in approach to information and engagement look like for a multi-sector agency like Save the Children and our other members that Catherine has just highlighted? There must be some opportunities to leverage or catalyze quite significant change. Big question. Short time.
Big question. I think quite key to it is just thinking through strategically what a more consistent adoption of a rights-based approach actually entails, and thinking of 3 key pillars. So of course, direct action by aid organizations in terms of making sure that we're providing information, that we're listening and we're supporting participation. So internally within Save the Children, I have in the past, and I will continue to do quite a lot of work with other kind of thematic areas, whether that is health, whether that is cash and voucher assistance, to help them think through, how can they be more consistent, more relevant, more accurate and timely within their information provision, but also kind of looking across the response as a whole. But as I think both of the previous panelists highlighted, we can't do that kind of in silo as a humanitarian aid organisation, and certainly not as a INGO. So that partnership with different actors, with media organisations, with local and national partners, and also with government is key. And I think, you know, broadening our focus also to help people, support people to develop skills to critically engage with information. I remember when I visited Ukraine in 2019 and worked with some children, and one of the things that they were saying consistently was that they identified misinformation as a key driver of the conflict. So it shouldn't just be about providing accurate information. We should also be perhaps working with media organisations to look at how we can support people to develop skills in critically interrogating information that's out there. I think the second key area, building on, you know, what Catherine was saying regarding the nexus, but also the fact that the incidence of crises in places like Turkey, where it is impossible for us to not engage with the government, is, you know, needs to push us and direct us to engage, to identify, you know, meaningful ways of helping duty bearers, including governments, improve their ability to uphold people's rights to information and participation. And that will help us in the long term, because, you know, aid organisations might not be there for a long time, but people's rights to information and participation will persist. So perhaps there's the opportunity, sometimes with crisis comes opportunity to find ways of doing things differently. And then I think kind of perhaps most importantly, something that I'm really keen on advocating for is that we should be really looking at how we can support crisis-affected children and adults to claim their rights and exercise their own agency. So that means looking at how we can promote children's own initiatives in this area, children's own initiatives in information sharing and participation. And thinking back to the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, it was a lesson for me in the power and creativity of child-led information sharing. At the time, like large aid organisations, we were really struggling to think, you know, what could we do in this very different context to what we're used to? And at that same time, across the world, there were child-led organisations in Nicaragua, Togo, Mali, Sudan, Cambodia, who were very quickly developing child-friendly information to target, to kind of counteract misinformation regarding coronavirus. So I think really one of the key things is that we need to stop assuming that crisis-affected people lack capacity and agency, and instead consider as a key part of our, rights-based approach to information, how we can, promote and support the own initiatives of affected people.
Thanks, Philippa. Coming to you, Asia, and then we'll come to questions. There's been a fair amount of agreement on what you've all been saying, and some examples in the chat. Sole has used an example of when referring to this idea of power imbalance, but of a CEO of an organization didn't want to be part of an activity because it was dangerous to attend. And instead of allowing the work to continue, they cancelled it to please the CEO. So then, just as an example, but Asia, coming to you now, you've talked a bit about the consequences of not providing equitable and free dialogue and information. Who are we missing from this conversation, and how can we change that? I think everybody has alluded to that, but who are we missing? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Rosie. It's really interesting to hear from Leila and Catherine and Philippa, really interesting insights, and just taking it from there. I think we often shy away from engaging with, we say we want to engage with community-based organizations, and we want to work with civil society and local media, but we're a bit hesitant. And often I notice that we're more comfortable working with national societies, like, for example, the Red Crescent or Red Cross. And I think there's so many other partners and so many opportunities So I think it's really what's missing is something that we keep saying, and it sounds cliche, but a localized response and localized partnerships. So third-party actors like civil society, local media, community-centered organizations or associations or committees, for example, like neighborhood committees or farmers association or women's association or the Tea Lady Collective. These are all groups that we could work with. Also recognizing that exactly what Philippa said, that crisis affected people or conflict affected people do have agency and are very creative and have ideas of how they want to address their own concerns, their own needs, challenges they face. So I'd like to give an example of this, of how the Internews rumor tracking methodology was used in Sudan by our partner CASE, or Khatim Adlan Enlightenment Center for Human Development. So they carry out listening groups, which are essentially a space for people to discuss their concerns, their information needs, their questions, misconceptions about the pandemic, vaccines, and other health issues, other humanitarian concerns, but primarily focusing on health issues. This is in 2 states that are conflict affected in Sudan, in the southern areas of the country, Blue Nile and South Kordofan state. So in Blue Nile state, there was some violence that took place that was ethnically motivated, targeting one group. And so the case team in Blue Nile state decided to use Internews rumor tracking methodology to track rumors and misinformation about conflict. And this was really important because there are lots of talk about who was to blame for the violence, what were the sources of these weapons, and if these rumors were left to kind of circulate and multiply, then they could lead to more conflict. So the teams adopted the methodology to suit their team, to suit their needs, and it was really effective in kind of reducing the potential conflict. And I think it's really, for me, I just want to highlight, it's really important to feel, to accept that there are other ways to do things. And this is really a great example of using a methodology that's intended for humanitarian issues, but wasn't really specifically for conflict prevention or looking at how to tackle misinformation about conflict, and it worked effectively. So that's a really great example. Another example that I'd like to share from YPR, our partner, they're a youth collective and they focus on tackling or addressing issues about preventing gender equality, issues affecting reproductive health within their communities, and they're active in all 18 states of Sudan. So they also conduct listening groups and they respond to community feedback, rumors, misconceptions, but they really formulate their responses based on the realities, on local realities. For example, they're not going to tell people, like people ask, how can I prevent COVID? If people don't have access to soap and water, that's not what they're going to say. People have access to, they look at people's reality, and a lot of people all around Sudan sit outdoors to socialize, and so kind of emphasizing what is possible, what is realistic within this setting. So I just wanted to give a few examples, and also, of course, Leila spoke about this as well, the media partnerships, really emphasizing those, and providing, helping in the ways we can, facilitating by providing tools or trainings or resources so that the media is more responsive, making those connections. I think that is a role that we can play, and we don't have to do everything as humanitarian responders, and there is a way to have a more localized response. Over to you, Rosie.
Thanks, Asya, and thanks everybody. I'm going to go to the questions that we have. We have 3 questions, so I'm proposing that I'm going to read them all, and we'll tackle them in that order. And I will come to you separately. They're quite different. So first question is from Prashan, who asks, do any of the panelists have real world examples of when increased access to information created a change in the power imbalance between affected people and humanitarian actors, one that had real impact on a humanitarian response? So that's one. Anna Thompson asked, given how entrenched and siloed the current cluster system is, can information as a right be integrated across all programming, or do we need a total overhaul of the way humanitarian services are organized and prioritized? And we have the final one is from Caroline of Wheelerman, who says, the theme of the World Press Freedom Day is that freedom of expression is a driver of all other human rights, implying that the right to information opens up other rights we have. Does the panel think this is the case? And if so, do others agree? So those are our 3 questions. So we'll start with Prashan's question, looking for real world examples of when increased access to information created a change in power imbalance. So not sure if any of the panel want to volunteer themselves. Catherine, go ahead.
Yeah, I do have one example. It was very interesting. This was during the Haiyan response in the Philippines. So noting that when Haiyan happened, I think over 200 organizations flocked to the Visayas region, all with their own programs, all doing their own thing. But there was this specific community where, so when they started to organize themselves eventually, the gaps were finally identified. So for example, in one community, in one barangay there, it was assigned to one of the agencies. And of course, agencies, you only have very limited funding and you have so many needs in the community. So when they came in, they were immediately they were very open to the community, saying, this is what we have. We can only have, I cannot give you the exact number. So for example, we can only provide and rebuild 50 houses out of this many needs in your community. So that in itself was a huge challenge already. Who do you say gets what? So what they did was opened it up to the community. This is what we have. This is the budget. How do you propose for us to go about it? So the community came up and said, why don't we talk about the criteria? Because, you know, some of the fully damaged houses, they have relatives who can help them. So we identify all fully damaged houses. We, among ourselves, will identify who is getting outside help from relatives and other friends, and who has really nothing. And then it was a long process, because every time there would be discussions. If there was a complaint, why not me? Even if I have somebody from abroad who could help me, but they're also affected, so they can't help me right now. So that discussions went on, and eventually they started sharing resources also among the community. So instead of just 50 families, they were able to help out more, just because the organization was very transparent of what they had and gave the community members the space to decide for themselves who gets what. And if there were any internal conflict, which usually backfires on the implementing agency, they talked about it amongst themselves. And in the process, you're building the resilience of the community and you're strengthening the relationships in the community. I don't know if that was very clear enough.
Very clear,
Okay.
yeah. So an example of, like in response to Prashan's question, an example of the provision of information, but also the right to participation. And I think that's one of the other barriers, isn't it? Is actually accepting engagement. and decision making. Is there anyone else that has an example? Leila, please go ahead.
Giving information to people, I think, had an impact to people who listen to us every day. So I shared a link on the chat. Maybe some of you will look at it. Radio Ergo uses the information to influence humanitarian agencies and aid agencies. So there are people, we looked back some of our success stories in this year during World Radio Day. So we have interviewed some of the people who have been affected by drought and also displaced from conflicts in their areas. So given the information they give us, it says a lot about how information sharing and talking about their situations in IDP camps help them to reach, or maybe aid agencies reach them and give them aid support. So yeah, I think we have many impacts in our information sharing, and that's one example of how Radio Ergo is affecting people using information and connecting aid agencies and also people who are in need. Thank you.
Thanks, Leila. The other, so we had two more questions. Maybe we'll move on to those quickly now. So maybe Anna's question, she said, given how entrenched and siloed the current cluster system is, can information as a right be integrated across all programming, or do we need a total overhaul of the way the humanitarian services are organized and prioritized? Maybe Asia, I'll put you on the spot for that one.
Okay. I feel, I don't know, like when you say overhauling of the entire system, that's gonna take years, and there's gonna, I mean, this sounds really bad to say, not saying that people will find a way to drag this, but I've just noticed when we're not especially keen on tackling a specific issue or integrating it into our programming as humanitarian responders. So we find ways to, or some people find ways to drag the issues, like, let's say, community feedback mechanisms. Let's put some boxes and tick that, off our checklist. So I think maybe mainstreaming it into programming might be helpful. And I sense that also having it prioritized as an issue rather than brushed over, having AAP prioritized, having looking at and looking at it from a rights based approach, like, is really important. And I think that is one of the main challenges to why we're not doing AAP or looking at information, people's access to information in a way that's really productive, because it's not being prioritized. It's more like saying, oh, okay, let's brush over it. But when you say, okay, this is something we're going to focus on, this is just as important as our other activities, and make sure that teams are trained, and then you can really mainstream it. But I think first we really have to spotlight it as an issue, and maybe create specific programs about this, rather than saying, okay, we're going to mainstream it across, because I think often the issue is that people don't know how to. It's not that they don't want to, or they don't have the good intentions. I think it's more like this discomfort and a bit of fear of how do I do this? How do I listen to people? How do I listen respectfully and provide a safe space and you know, not be affected or not allow my own emotions and how I perceive their criticism, not allowing it to affect me in such a way, looking at this positively, that this could improve our humanitarian programming, and that this would really help, would help or enhance people's sense of respect and treating them with dignity, because it's such a sensitive thing, and but it really helps. And it really makes people feel empowered and heard and listened to. So I think prioritizing it as a key issue first in humanitarian action or in activities and programs is really important. And then we can mainstream it across different sectors. Over to you.
Thank you. Yes, so sort of incremental changes that we can make. I think we tend to get quite excited about sort of blowing up the system, but perhaps we need to be more practical. I wanted to come to our last question, and I'm aware of time. So it might be that we sort of put it out there and we reflect on it, but this is from Caroline, who asked, the theme of the World Press Freedom Day is that freedom of expression is a driver of all other human rights, implying that the right to information opens up other rights that we have. For us, this is pertinent. One of our outputs as CDAC is to write a sort of network briefing ahead of it. 3rd of May is World Press Freedom Day. What does the panel think? Do we think this is the case? And do others agree? Perhaps just very quick reflections on that. Maybe Philippa will come to you.
Sure, and yeah, I couldn't agree more really with that. While of course, recognizing, as I said, there's no hierarchy of rights, but I think the right to information, the right to freedom of expression is foundational. If people don't have information, if they don't have information about how the crisis is developing, what aid to keep themselves and their families safe after disaster, people will have even more power taken away from them. They won't be able to take action that supports their right to health, their right to protection, their right to education, etc. If you don't know what you're entitled to, what the options are, then you're much less able to claim your other rights. So yeah, I think I agree fully that it is foundational. Thanks,
Philippa. Anybody else? Maybe Leila put you on the spot. Do you have any thoughts on this last question?
Yeah, I think the other panelist has pointed out. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. And we came to an end. We're on time. I think it's been a really rich conversation. From our side, we're recording it and we're noting a lot. I think a number of different points came out. I think first of all, we looked at this in the context of information as aid. Probably that we've all come to the consensus. It is it's an artificial distinction. Information as aid is built on the principles of rights. But so maybe it comes down to semantics. In that respect, in terms of the conversation around rights, we talked about it being blockages coming in lots of different forms, some of them excuses, some related to power, to paternalism, and other sort of political blockages, some very practical. We concluded there with a suggestion that we talk more about how we can achieve this, particularly mainstreaming across different sectors. An agreement that more needs to be done.